One of the classic strategies that bad governments use to stay in power, they'll contrive some kind of a conflict just as an election is happening. So it becomes a national crisis. The election happens, but the government says, listen, we can't change horses in this stream, right? We're just going to have to stay in power till we solve this gigantic problem, because if we spend 3 months in a transition, we're existentially threatened. We could lose this war if we aren't on top of this thing every minute of every day. It's completely possible that that's the kind of false flag that our government, which has proven itself willing to do all kinds of crazy things, might try. But you could also have the cyber attack. And remember this, we're heading into winter in November. And if the power grid is shut down, that's a semi-existential threat. It's existential for a lot of people who are caught in snowstorms with no electricity. And that could be an excuse. There are lots, or in another pandemic, right? They're testing out monkeypox and bird flu to see if one of those would be scary enough to allow them to shut down the economy and scare enough people into obeying. And maybe that's the thing that they use, or maybe some combination of those things. There's an awful lot that we now know, after the pandemic and after that CrowdStrike thing, we know it's possible for a big crisis to lead a lot of people to be very willing to obey even crazy orders from the government. I'm not saying I think it is. I'm saying it's probably on the list of things that the aristocracy is wargaming right now. They're probably thinking, all right, can we do this? Can we do that? How would this work? They've got experts from Homeland Security and the CIA and the FBI all sitting around gaming it out, seeing how it would go. Leaving everything else aside, our elections are pretty easily stolen right now because we've put a lot of procedures in place that can't be checked. If you're using voting machines that don't leave a paper trail and that sometimes are connected to the internet and that we know now for a fact can be hacked, then if it's a close race but one guy wins by a small amount, how do you know that's really real? Here in Washington State, we have 100% mail-in balloting, where you get a ballot in the mail, you fill it out, you pop it back in the mail, and how do we know really here how many people are just sitting down with piles of ballots and then signing names of people who they know aren't going to vote to them and then voting with those hundreds of thousands of ballots? There's really no way to check that. It's possible that instead of starting World War III and assassinating one of the candidates, they'll just steal this election and have no way to check it. So lots of things can happen. I don't know if we should trust any of it because we know the guys in charge are capable already of lying and cheating. And there's no reason to think that they're going to stop being who they are. And I don't know how you ever get back to a trustworthy democracy again, because once you've, absolutely seen an election be stolen. And we should note, too, that the two big political parties already think that the last two elections, at least one of them, were stolen, right? The Democrats thought 2016 was stolen by the Russians in collusion with Trump. The Republicans think that 2020 was stolen by Biden, and now we've got 2024 where everybody's primed to look for cheating if they lose. So that's kind of a recipe for civil unrest at least, and a civil war very possibly. In this world, never really impute motives to people anymore because everybody's lying about everything, so you just don't know what's really true. What CrowdStrike said was that that whole thing was caused by a small subset or a subsection of their code being updated, just a little update, and it wouldn't run with everything else, and it shut down the internet, or a big chunk of the internet. There was a thing just before that. Remember when all the car dealerships got shut down? Because a company that provided information services got hacked, and so 15,000 car dealerships, all their systems were down. So they could be test runs where the aristocracy is trying to figure out exactly how these things play out when they happen and how would you do it if you were going to do it. And so they're testing and they're seeing how it works. Or it could just be that we're not so competent anymore. In the US, it seems like we can't do things like we can't build jet planes anymore. And there's all kinds of other things that just don't work as well as they used to. Medical systems don't work anymore. Yeah. So it could be just part of that we're just kind of losing our competence, maybe because of peak complexity. Things have just gotten so complicated that humans can't run them anymore. So I don't know. But I think in a way we're pretty lucky, though, that these things are happening. The CrowdStrike thing and the hacking of the car dealership thing, because it gives us a little hint of what it'll be like when a real cyber attack happens or a real virus gets into the big systems and shuts them all down. It tells us what we need to be doing to prepare. Like, do you have a generator yet? Maybe you should, because what if the CrowdStrike thing happened and went on for a week in February, right? And, with gardening and with what kind of vehicle we should have and things like that. Do you put a wood stove in your house? There are all these things that we could be looking at and thinking through, trying to make that one thing work as well as possible in the scenario in which the next CrowdStrike is 2 weeks in the winter, something like that. So there's 20 different things we need to think through to make sure we get it right. And on the financial side, what happens to your money when the internet goes down? How do you get the money, the credit that's in your credit cards or the money that's in your bank account or your Bitcoin wallet or whatever? So what do you do about that? Maybe you want physical gold and silver that you've put in a place that nobody else knows about, or maybe one other person knows about, and that you can get to. If things go down, you just bring your silver coins to the farmer's market, and they're more than willing to give you a week's worth of veggies or some honey or some chicken or whatever. So you plan in that sense too, and what you can do about it. And then you get the sense of satisfaction when you complete the list and you're basically set up for this one thing. Your generator is going to run for X number of hours or days or weeks. And the wood stove, you got plenty of firewood. So that wood stove is basically a permanent source of heat, and your gold and silver coins are where they need to be. It's both fun putting it together and then very satisfying when you get it complete. Same thing with gardening. It's a nightmare for the first 3 years. But after you figure out what to do about voles and things like that, and you end up making 1/3 of your food. And that's very satisfying too. All of these things are possible. All of us can do versions of this stuff. We need to do it right so we don't waste a lot of effort. And we need to do the right things so the most likely thing is what we deal with first and then on down the list. Very interesting times. And I kind of feel a sense of urgency now because it feels like we're getting to the point where one of those big things is imminent. And I'm not saying it is imminent. I'm not saying the next year is some kind of gigantic disaster, but it feels like the water is being tested for something pretty big. And that could be wrong, but it feels like it. Maybe in the coming year, we need to have a lot of our plans done, ready, all lined up. The book, The Money Bubble, came out in 2014. And the things that it predicted are all coming true, but just now. It's 10 years later. And that book is actually timely now because all of the stuff that it predicted are just happening now, like interest rates rising because inflation is spiking and instability in the financial markets and, this bubble and that bubble all blowing up. That's all taking place now. So that the biggest lesson was that can't really tell how long something is going to take, even if it's obviously coming. So you need to be careful in your investing in regards to some scenario. You decide something's going to happen and you're completely convinced that it's coming. A guy named Rick Rule, who's very big in the gold mining analysis space, and he likes to say that you do not want to mix up imminent and inevitable, because those are two very different things. So imminent means it's happening right away. You can bet the farm on it. Inevitable means it's coming, but you don't know when. And you need to know which one your scenario is. That was very important to me because I started betting on the money bubble bursting scenario sooner than I should have. Really, it's basically now that would be a good time to start putting all those bets on. So I put them on a few years ago, and it wasn't a great few years. Not a disaster, but not great either, because being too soon is like being wrong until you're right, and you just hope that the right comes soon enough to keep you from going bankrupt. But the things that seemed likely to happen in 2014 were valid, and they're all happening now. The governments of the world are going bankrupt because they're taking on more and more debt, and now the debt has gone parabolic. It's going straight up. The U.S. took its first 220 years of existence to accumulate $11 trillion of debt. And then since 2020, we've taken on another $11 trillion. So now we're doing in 4 years what it used to take centuries to do in terms of debt accumulation. Japan is the same thing. Their debt is going straight up. Their interest costs are spiraling out of control. Europe has all these unfunded liabilities where they didn't put any money aside for their versions of Social Security and Medicare. there. And now they're rapidly heading for bankruptcy as baby boomers retire and there's no money to cover them. All this stuff is happening. And it means that the financial system is ready to spin out of control. I'm willing to move it from eventual to inevitable to imminent now. So I think in the next few years, a lot of the things that, have been going to happen and didn't are ready to start happening. And some examples of that are, for instance, the U.S. government's debt is spiking now because baby boomers are retiring and governments have just, the U.S. government has just lost its ability to control its spending. So debt is going up. The interest on that debt, now that we had to raise interest rates in response to inflation, the interest on that debt is going straight up. It was a few $100 billion a year not long ago. Now it's above $1 trillion, heading for $1.6 trillion each year. That means we spend more money on interest than we spend on the military and on Social Security, and pretty soon, or on Medicare. And pretty soon we're going to spend as much as we do on Social Security. That is a death spiral for a major country. When you get into that kind of financial territory where everything is just growing exponentially and there's nothing you can do to stop it, your system breaks down at some point in the not too distant future. And we in the US are headed for that. Japan is headed for that. China might be. They're more opaque, but they might actually be worse than us. And Europe, in a lot of ways, Europe is just a dying culture. There's a book called The Strange Death of Europe, worth reading because it really gets at what's happening over there. So you put all those things together and you get a global financial system that is on the verge of going bust. So the experiment that began in 1971, when we went off the gold standard and gave everybody fiat currencies that they could just make more of out of thin air, it's ending. And it's ending in the not too distant future. And that's what makes this time fascinating from an economics nerd standpoint, because this is financial and economic history. They're going to be writing textbooks about this for the next 2 centuries, and we're living through it. But it's also terrifying because the reason they're going to be writing about it for all those decades and centuries is that extreme things are going to happen right now. And there's no guarantee that we come through this in great shape. I see us rolling over into a recession pretty soon here for a couple of reasons. One is the money during the pandemic, because a lot of people, the government said, well, you don't have to pay your rent, you don't have to pay your student loans, and here's some stimmy checks. So as a society, we build up something called excess savings, which is more money in the bank than would be expected by just extrapolating prior trends. And it was a couple $1 trillion, basically, that U.S. consumers had to spend as we came out of the pandemic. And we've been spending it. And that's why the economy has still been growing to the extent that it has been, because people had this extra money. Well, we've spent all that. Now we're into negative territory. So we're, instead of excess savings, we're negative savings. So that can't go on for much longer because consumers are tapped out. Now, at the same time that is happening, credit card debt is going up as people put more and more of their day-to-day life on plastic. So that means you've got more and more people out there carrying loan balances that's charging them, 25% a year or whatever credit cards charge now, which is a recipe for personal bankruptcy, right? You can't manage an ongoing loan if the interest is 25%. So you combine those two things and you get much lower consumer spending going forward. And the economy is 70% consumer spending, so that alone gives you a recession. Then you look over at real estate and you see that commercial real estate and office buildings in particular are rolling over into what could be a pretty big bust, because so many office buildings got built in the past 10 years using super cheap money, 2% interest or whatever. And now they need to be refinanced at today's higher interest rates. And during the pandemic, a lot of people found out that working from home is way nicer than going into an office. So offices aren't very full anymore anyhow. So the cash flow is low, the refinancing costs are high, and the price at which these office buildings change hands is plunging. Now, a lot of banks have that bad paper on their balance sheets, and they're going to have to report the resulting losses in the office building sector. And that is probably going to spook depositors who pull their money out of local and regional banks, forcing the local and regional banks to sell more of their depreciated assets and report even bigger losses, and so on. So you get a real estate bust causing a bank bust and forcing the government to step in and bail out what is a pretty big sector. Local and regional banks are several $1 trillion in assets. So that will alone by itself cause a recession too. So you got multiple things that each one is big enough to cause a downturn, but there's several of them happening at once. And that's what I see for next year. Towards the end of this year, it should really be going, because you remember it's an election year. And so the government is actively trying to support the economy to keep the incumbents in power. Take that away and they won't care so much next year. And that's when things really start to fall apart. So I think we get a recession next year. And then I think the potential, because there's so much bad debt out there, the potential for a garden variety recession turning into a capital D depression is very real. And that spooks the world's governments into easing really aggressively. So then we go back to zero interest rates and stuff. And that's when gold and silver go through the roof. Because at the end of each bull market for precious metals, there's this parabolic run where they just go straight up. And when governments start aggressively cutting interest rates again, I think that's when it happens for precious metals. So if you want to place a bet on something, a leveraged bet where you use options or something like that, long dated call options on gold and silver, and some of the really high quality miners in that space might be a reasonable speculation. And it might work out in the next couple of years. And there are lots of other investment ideas that flow from the idea of a recession coming sooner rather than later. A lot of them are on the short side, where you're betting against the stock market because a recession usually makes stocks go way down. But there are a few things you can buy, like the gold miners and gold and silver themselves, that ought to go up in that kind of a scenario. It's kind of a hidden time bomb in our system, where people who think they're going to make, let's say, $3,000 a month from their pension going forward are actually going to get maybe the real equivalent of $1,500. And they don't know that yet. They're walking through life, later life, thinking that they're basically covered, that they got a pension that's going to pay their bills. And that money doesn't exist. So you want to talk about a lack of trust in society? Wait till all the cops and teachers and firemen find out that their pension's only worth half of what they thought it was. That's going to be a revelation. And it's coming soon, because a lot of the assets in state and local pension funds are stocks and bonds and real estate, things that can go down. So they're already underfunded, but they can get much more underfunded to the point of insolvency pretty soon. Federal governments of the world who are able to print more money, and they will cover their version of Social Security and Medicare by running the printing press. That'll be inflationary and cause civil unrest and mass bankruptcy, et cetera, et cetera. We found that out in 2022, what double-digit inflation looks like. And then the state and local pension plans will just go bust, that they'll just default and only pay out a fraction of what they were supposed to. And that's all coming. That's moving from inevitable to imminent too. So that's next 5 years kind of thing for a lot of these plans. The AIG thing is even more interesting because they're an insurance company, AIG, which you normally would think would be pretty stodgy, right? But what they were doing is loading up on things called derivatives, which are basically just private sector instruments. You and a hedge fund cut a deal to pay this if interest rates do this and that if interest rates do that, that kind of thing. Well, they had loaded up on so many derivatives that if their derivatives book blew up on them, which it was in process of doing in 2008, it would have taken down Goldman Sachs, I'm not exaggerating here, Goldman Sachs, Merrill Lynch, Bank of America, JP Morgan Chase, and Citigroup. All those banks would have ceased to exist if AIG wasn't bailed out. So that was the first big bailout. The federal government stepped in and said, well, we can't let that happen. So we'll just guarantee all your derivatives contracts. And so the same thing will happen again in some form this time around. It won't be identical, but it'll be some kind of, okay, we're going to run the printing presses and we're going to give you a bunch of guarantees to keep this horrible thing from happening. But because this is the everything bubble, it's likely that, you got the whole world involved in this one, and there's no real way to play whack-a-mole in that way, where you bail this thing out and fix this problem, but you made this other problem worse by bailing this first thing out. And I think that's where we're going to be. There's no solution for that except for the financial system just to break down and be reset. That's the big transition that we'll go through at some point, where we just do away with this whole fiat currency, fractional reserve banking thing that worked for a while and has failed miserably now, and we'll replace it with some kind of maybe a gold standard, some kind of a monetary system where governments aren't allowed to create unlimited amounts of paper or electronic currency out of thin air. We'll take that power away from the governments. There are ways to play that. There's an investment thesis in that crazy monetary reset thing that we've got coming. And it's possible to treat that like an opportunity and place the correct bets for it. We'll just have to see which those bets are.